Hello and welcome to episode 7 of Geostrategy with me, your host and your personal geostrategist, AbhijitChavda. So, today we are going to discuss the war, the new war that has erupted, the Israel Iran war. And this is a complicated matter. We in India are on good terms with both sides. This is not our war. This is not a war that's good for the world. And in this show, we don't do superficial analysis, we do deep dives. So let us understand what this war is all about. What is the history behind this? What has happened thus far in the past few days? What's the situation like? What are the parties, the sides, the nations that are involved in this, and what directions could this war possibly go towards, and what could be the geopolitical implications of the various scenarios that could ensue could come out as a consequence of this war. So let us do a deep dive into this particular conflict that has started just recently, just a week or so ago. So let us first begin by doing a comparison of the strengths and weaknesses of the two sides, Israel as well as Iran. So if we look at the the geographic makeup of the two nations and the demographic nation makeup of the two nations, you will see that Iran has a gigantic population compared to Israel. Iran's population is roughly 90.4 million people. The median age is 34 and the 34 years, and the total fertility rate in Iran is 1.68 births per woman. Israel has a population that is 9.4 million roughly, and it has a median age that's lower than that of Iran, 29.2 years, and the total fertility rate is 2.89, significantly higher than Iran. And if you look at the size difference, then you will see that Iran is 75 times larger than Israel. So that's a significant. So Iran has a significantly larger population that gives it a significantly larger pool of potential military recruits and workforce, and this obviously has strategic implications and military capabilities. And when it comes to the size, well, Israel is about 1.33 percentage of the size of Iran. So this huge difference, vast difference in territory, gives Iran a significant strategic depth and various kinds of geographical advantages. Let's compare further. We're just beginning here. So let's compare the GDP, the annual GDP, the economic aspects, and the military spending of the two nations. So Iran's GDP is about $454 billion. Iran is ranked 29th globally, and Iran's GDP per capita is about $4,466, and Israel has a GDP of about $398 billion, but the GDP per capita is incredibly different from that of Iran. Israel's GDP per capita is 52,642. So Iran has a slightly larger nominal GDP, but Israel has a significantly larger GDP per capita because of its much smaller population. Iran's economy is heavily dependent on petroleum products, fossil fuels, while Israel has a much more diversified, technology focused economy. If you look at the annual military expenditure, then Israel spends about $46.5 billion annually, roughly, which is about 8.8% of its GDP, the second highest military burden essentially globally. And its GDP has increased 65% over its military budget has increased 65% over the last year, while Iran has a military budget of about $8 billion, about $7.9 billion. This is a 10% decrease from the previous year because of economic sanctions. So Israel spends about 6 times more on its defense than Iran in absolute terms, and it spends dramatically more as a percentage of its GDP. So as you can see, Israel has a significant advantage over here when it comes to the military expenditure that it can use. Now, when it comes to nuclear capabilities, it is believed that Israel has about 80 to 90 nuclear warheads. Iran doesn't have, as far as we know, any current nuclear weapons. Israel has a policy of nuclear opacity. It neither confirms nor denies the possession of nuclear warheads. Neither of the parties Neither of the nations are a party to the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Israel is believed to have about 50 warheads that are deliverable via missiles and about 30 warheads that are deliverable via aircraft. Israel, when it comes to Iran, Iran has accumulated sufficient uranium enriched to about 60% 60% purity. You could say probably to near weapons grade levels. So Iran could potentially have sufficient fissile material to produce about 9 nuclear warheads. That's the best estimate that we have right now. And Iran could potentially develop a basic nuclear device within weeks to months if it chooses to do so. So that's the best estimate that we have. Iran has all kinds of various kinds of missiles that it can use to deliver nuclear warheads, but that also could require significantly longer time to mate the warheads with the missiles and so on. So that's about the nuclear capabilities. Now let's take a look at the military personnel, the ground forces, and so on and so forth. Iran has approximately 610,000 active military personnel, plus about 350,000 reserves. That's a total of 960,000, almost a million. When it comes to Israel, they have about 169,500 active personnel, and the reserves are pretty large. That's 465,000 in reserve. So the total is about 635,000 military personnel that Israel has. Iran's ground forces are about 1996 tanks, 65,000 or so armored vehicles, and 775 rocket artillery, etc. Rocket artillery systems. And Israel has about 1370 tanks, including some advanced models, the Merkava models of the tanks. Israel has about 43,407 armored vehicles and 650 self-propelled artillery units. Now, when it comes to tanks, etc., the two nations are separated by about roughly 1,000 kilometers of distance. So tanks may not come into the picture. Armored vehicles may not really come into the picture, but it's the aerial forces, the air power, the missile systems, etc., that will dominate the war if it continues. So let's take a look at the air power of both the nations and the naval power as well. So if you look at Iran's air power, they have 551 total aircraft, which includes 186 fighter jets, mostly older Soviet models and pre-1979 US equipment. It is believed some of that may have been destroyed by Israeli strikes. Iran also has 129 helicopters, including 13 attack helicopters. Israel's air power is different. It has 612 total aircraft, which includes 241 fighter jets, which includes F-35s, F-16s, and F-15 aircraft. Israel has 146 helicopters, including 48 attack helicopters. Iran's naval forces aren't very large, and the same can be said about Israel. So Iran has about 7 frigates and 3 submarines, and 30 plus submarines of other kinds and 80 patrol vessels. Israel has 5 submarines, 7 corvettes, and 45 to 49 patrol vessels. Now let's look at the allies that the two nations have. Right? So Iran has a number of allies. With Russia, Iran has a strategic partnership, especially when it comes to Syria and military cooperation. Iran has a significant alliance, growing economic and strategic ties with China. China has invested significantly in Iran. They have a 25-year strategic pact of some kind, the details of which are kind of obscure, but you have that. Syria, well, the regime has changed in Syria. The Americans have been able to place a pro-US government in power, but Iran would still have proxy support in Syria of various kinds. And there are the proxy or allied forces, which is Hezbollah, which is in Lebanon. There's Hamas, which is in Gaza. There's the Houthis in Yemen, and various Iraqi militias because of Iran's significant presence, you could say, within Iraq's territory. And then North Korea also is an ally of Iran. There's military technological cooperation between Iran and North Korea. Now, what are the primary alliances when it comes to Israel? So when it comes to Israel, the primary ally, the all-weather ally, the unconditional ally, is the United States, the world's hegemon, the sole superpower in the world. So the US is the primary strategic ally. It provides significant military aid, diplomatic support, and other kinds of support to Israel. Then the EU, the European Union, is also a strong ally of Israel. They have strong economic and diplomatic ties. Um, Israel has normalized relations with various Arab states like Egypt, Jordan, the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan, etc. And when it comes to Saudi Arabia, once again, the two nations are developing informal cooperation, especially when it comes to Iran. So these are Israel's alliances. Now, let's take a look at some more relevant factors, strategic factors. When it comes to Iran, Iran is an oil dependent economy and it is significantly impacted by sanctions. On the other side, on the other hand, Israel is a highly diversified, high tech economy with a strong innovation sector. When it comes to the military posture, the doctrine of both nations, both countries employ a hybrid defensive offensive doctrine. Iran focuses on asymmetric warfare through various allies and proxies, like the ones that we just mentioned: Hezbollah, Houthi, Hamas, the Houthis, Hamas, and so on and so forth. And Israel, it has a doctrine of maintaining technological superiority and preemptive capabilities, that which we saw in the past week or so. When it comes to geography, Iran has a significant amount of strategic depth. It has a diverse kinds of terrain, mountainous terrain, and so on and so forth. Iran has multiple borders with various nations that provide it various kinds of strategic options. Israel has a compact, small territory that requires advanced rapid response capabilities and advanced early warning systems. So the two nations have fundamentally different strategic approaches. Iran gets to leverage its size, its population, its allied and proxy networks for regional influence, while Israel relies on technological superiority, its international alliances, its all weather friendship with the United States, and Israel has significant qualitative military advantages to maintain its security in the regional environment. Now, let's take a look at the strategic approaches. So, like I said, yeah, this is what we just discussed. Israel has a strategy of technological superiority, international alliances, and so on and so forth. And Iran has a very different strategic approach compared to Israel. So that's a brief comparison of the strengths and weaknesses, etc., of Iran as well as Israel. Right? Both have certain strengths, both have some weaknesses, but overall, it looks like Israel has significant advantages of multiple kinds. Now, let's understand the history of this conflict. How did this conflict come to be? Why have we reached where we have reached? Why do we have the situation right now? So we have to understand the history. We have to go back in time to understand how this happened. So the early relations were that of cooperation between Israel and Iran. So you had a dictatorship in Iran. I'll not go back all the way to the 1900s, early 1900s, for the origin of the dictatorship, but you had a dictatorship in Iran that was propped up by the West. That was the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and Iran and Israel were kind of allies, and they were cooperating. So Iran was among the first Muslim majority nations to recognize Israel after the formation of Israel in 1948. So Iran was the second Muslim nation after Turkey to recognize Israel. And this recognition came despite Iran's initial vote against the United Nations partition plan for Palestine, etc. But eventually, Iran gave its recognition to Israel. Now, in 1953, the CIA and the MI6 of the UK, they did something called Operation Ajax, which was a regime change operation, which was a coup in Iran. And this coup overthrew the Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, and it reinstated the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who had briefly fled the country. And the deal was that the Shah of Iran was very happy to allow the West, especially the US and the UK, to benefit from Iran's oil reserves at very good prices, at very good rates. And Mohammad Mossadegh, the prime minister, had actually decided to nationalize the Iranian oil industry and to sell it to whoever would pay the highest price. So that was not good for the West. So that's why they did this coup in 1953. They ousted Mohammad Mossadegh, the nationalist Iranian prime minister, and they brought back the Shah, who was very strongly pro-West. So the moment the Shah comes back to power, relations between Iran and Israel once again improved significantly. And from the 1960s all the way to the 1970s, there was a strategic partnership that formed between various non-Arab powers, which were surrounded by hostile Arab states, which is Iran and Israel. So this kind of created a natural alliance based on shared security concerns. Iran and Israel are very different nations culturally, but they formed this alliance because of shared security concerns. Both of them found the Arab nations that surrounded them to be hostile. And this alignment fit perfectly with Israel's periphery doctrine, which sought alliances with non Arab states on the edges of West Asia to counter the then what you had, the Arab hostility against Israel that was prevalent at the time. So early relations were pretty good all the way until the 1970s. So what kind of cooperation did you have? You had economic and military cooperation under the dictatorship of the Shah of Iran. So you had oil trade. Iran supplied Israel with a significant portion of Israel's oil needs, especially after the 1967 Six-Day War. And so Iranian oil at the time was being shipped to European markets via a joint Israeli-Iranian pipeline, the Eilat Ashkelon pipeline. Then you had commercial relations between the two nations. So the trade between the two nations flourished, and Israeli construction companies and engineers were pretty active. They were working actively in Iran. There was transportation links. So the Israeli national airline El Al, it operated direct flights between Tel Aviv and Tehran. And this facilitated business, it facilitated tourism, and so on. And then there was military cooperation. The two nations maintained largely secret but pretty robust military cooperation, including joint weapons development projects like Project Flower, which was an attempt to develop a new missile system. So you had pretty robust cooperation, and Israel maintained an embassy, a permanent delegation in Tehran, which served like a de facto embassy. And they even had formal ambassadors that were exchanged between the two countries in the 1970s. So it was a pretty robust relationship that you had. And then what happened? Then you saw a period of growing opposition to Israel within Iran. And this is not something that happened at the end stage in the 1970s. It was something that was always there. So in 1949, there was this religious leader called Ayatollah Mahmoud Taleghani of Iran, who visited the West Bank. Okay, and he began advocating for Palestinian rights within Iran. So that's in the 1940s, 50s, and even 1960s. Then there was Ayatollah Abul Ghassem Kashani, who criticized the Iranian government's diplomatic relations with Israel, and he viewed Israel as a colonial outpost. Then you had Ruhollah Khomeini, who would later become the great Ayatollah Khomeini and lead the Iranian Revolution. He was very vocal in his criticism of the Pahlavi dynasty, the Shah dynasty, and its ties with Israel. And he viewed the nation of Israel as a supporter of the dictatorship of the Shah. Then there was a Six-Day War in 1967 between Israel and various Arab nations. After that, Iranian clerics started raising funds for Palestinians. And this alarmed the dictatorship of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. And this government, the Iranian government of the time, the Shah's government, tried to prevent such activities. And these sentiments would later form the ideological foundation for Iran's post-revolutionary, post-1979 stance towards Israel. So that's the background. Then you had the Islamic Revolution, 1979 revolution, Khomeini's revolution. So this was a fundamental turning point, inflection point in the relationship between Iran and Israel. So the Shah, Muhammad Reza Pahlavi was overthrown, and the Islamic Republic was established under Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, and this completely transformed Iran's political orientation, foreign policy orientation. The new Islamic regime viewed Iran not just as a political adversary, but as an illegitimate nation, illegitimate state, and a tool of Western imperialism. So Ayatollah Khomeini declared Israel as an enemy of Islam and the little shaitan. And of course, the US was the great shaitan, Shaitan-e-Bozorg, right? So this became not just merely rhetoric or ideology, but it became a core tenet of the Islamic Republic and its foreign policy and its domestic discourse. So Ayatollah Khomeini, he effectively mobilized the Iranian people against the Shah of Iran, against Israel, and against the US. And he established his legitimacy through this opposition to these entities. So complete U-turn begins in 1979. Then there was the formal severance of ties between the two nations. So the revolution happened, and then Iran took various concrete steps to demonstrate its hostility towards Israel. So first of all, Iran cut off all official diplomatic relations with Israel. It ended diplomatic ties, commercial ties, cultural ties, everything. The Israeli embassy in Tehran was closed, and it was handed over to the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was then headed by Yasser Arafat. Right? Iran stopped accepting Israeli passports, and people who held Iranian passports were banned from traveling to the occupied Palestine, which is how they described Israel. And then there was a Jewish exodus from Iran. So the Jewish community in Iran had been the second largest community of Jews in the Middle East outside of Israel, and this now saw a significant exodus outside of Iran. More than, and yet about 20,000 Jews, or maybe more than that, continued to live in Iran. So significant changes happen over here, as you can see. So then you had the Iran-Iraq war. So the Iran-Iraq war, it was between Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and Saddam Hussein, who was obviously, as we know, a proxy of the US. So now what you have is there is pragmatic cooperation between the two nations, despite the public hostility. So pragmatic considerations, practical considerations led to continued secret cooperation between Iran and Israel during this period of the Iran-Iraq war, which was from 1980 to 1988. So this all began with Saddam Hussein deciding to invade Iran in 1980, and Iran found itself isolated internationally and in desperate need for military supplies. And Israel, despite being a US ally, it viewed Saddam Hussein's Iraq, as a greater threat than the revolutionary regime in Iran. So Israel provided significant military assistance to Iran during this period. And about 80%, it is said, of the weaponry that was bought by Iran after the onset of this war originated in Israel. So Israel sold to Iran about $75 million worth of arms from stocks of Israel military industries, Israel aircraft industries, etc., in what they called Operation Seashell. So this was a secret cooperation, a secret alliance. So what are the factors that motivated this very strange, seemingly contradictory relationship? So from Iran's perspective, Iraq's invasion of Iran was an existential threat, and Iran was isolated diplomatically, internationally. So because of that, it made sense to cooperate with Israel for the time being. From Israel's perspective, supporting Iran against Iraq, it had the objective of preventing an easy Iraqi victory, which would have significantly changed the geopolitical balance of power in the region in a way that would be unfavorable to Israel. So both nations, Iran and Israel, saw value in maintaining some level of relationship despite that public hostility. And So the Israelis believed that it was important to leave a small kind of window open to the possibility of good relations with Iran in the future. Um, so during the war, throughout the war, there was about 100 or slightly more Israeli advisors, technicians, etc., in Iran at any given time. At any given time, they would live in carefully guarded and secluded camps outside of Tehran, and this continued even as Iran's leaders denounced Israel in public speeches, in Friday prayers, etc. Public denunciations continued, but privately they were cooperating out of practical necessities. So this went on as long as the Iran Iraq war went on, continued. Then there was an escalation of hostilities. So the Iran Iraq war ended in a stalemate, 1988. Nobody really won. And then there was a turn to open hostility between Israel and Iran. So a lot of things happened around this time, early 1990s. You had the end of the Iran Iraq war. Then you had the collapse of the USSR, the Soviet Union. So this was another big turning point in the relationship between Iran and Israel. So one of their common enemies was weakened, another was gone, and then the ideological differences between the two nations became more pronounced, and they became the driving factor in the relationship. So at this point in time, you had an Israeli prime minister called Yitzhak Rabin, and his government adopted a pretty strong, aggressive posture towards Iran. And Iran intensified its anti Israel activities and rhetoric and so on. So, what are the factors that happened in this that contributed to this escalation? So, Iran was supporting militant groups opposed to Israel, particularly Hezbollah in Lebanon, and then later Hamas in the Palestinian territories. And Israel at this point in time started to become concerned about there were growing concerns in Israel about Iran's nuclear program and Iran's regional ambitions. And Iran was opposed to the Israeli Palestinian peace process, the Oslo Accords of 1993. So, all of these factors contributed to the escalation of hostilities between the two nations. So, this begins in the 1990s, continues into the 2000s, right? And then there is the emergence of proxy warfare. So, Hezbollah was formed in 1982. That's essentially when the Iran Iraq war has kind of just begun, essentially. Uh, so this happened in response to Israel's invasion of Lebanon. So Iran helped establish and support Hezbollah. Iran provided ideological indoctrination. Iran provided military training to Hezbollah. Iran provided equipment to Hezbollah. Iran trained and armed Hezbollah to resist Israel's occupation of southern Lebanon, which continued until around 2000. And Iran also developed relationships with various Palestinian groups, particularly the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas. And this continues essentially until today, right? So this proxy warfare, and it is said that the Americans report that Iran gives about $100 million yearly to various Palestinian groups, and Israeli security assesses that Iran has increased its funding to Hamas to about $350 million per year. This is pretty recent figures, 2023 and so on. So this proxy warfare strategy allowed Iran to confront Israel indirectly, and it also allowed Iran to build influence across the region. In 2006, there was the Lebanon war between Israel and Hezbollah, and this demonstrated the effectiveness of Iran's approach, with the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, the IRGC, believed to have directly assisted Hezbollah fighters in their attacks on Israel and their war with Israel. So now it's very clear that there is open hostility, but it's still not state on state hostility. It is proxy hostility. But the two nations are very clear adversaries in the region. Then what happens? Then the nuclear dimension emerges. So Israel has been a nuclear power, an undeclared nuclear power for many decades. But now Iran also started developing nuclear ambitions. Iran developed a nuclear program, and this became a central point of contention in the Israel-Iran relationship and the Israel-Iran conflict. So from Israel's perspective, a nuclear-armed Iran is an existential threat. Given Iran's hostile attitude towards Israel and Iran's support for various anti-Israel groups, so Israel views this as an existential threat. And Iran has always maintained that its nuclear program is for peaceful purposes. But Israel and its Western allies suspect that Iran seeks nuclear weapons capability. So there's been a international response. The international community has responded. The international community, which is the Western community, has responded to Iran's nuclear activities with sanctions and various kinds of diplomatic activity initiatives. There was a breakthrough into 2015, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, which imposed various kinds of restrictions on Iran's nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. This was under the Obama administration. Then Mr. Trump comes to power in 2016, and the United States then withdrew unilaterally from the JCPOA, this agreement, in 2018. And this led to the agreement's collapse and Iran's resumption of its nuclear activities beyond the limitations imposed by that agreement with the United States. So now, in the meanwhile, there were all kinds of covert operations and sabotage against Iran's nuclear program. Whether it's by the Israelis or by the West doesn't matter, but it's one single comprehensive target, which is Iran. So one of the biggest sabotage operations was the Stuxnet cyber attack. So this began in 2010. A very sophisticated computer worm or virus called Stuxnet, which is believed to have been developed jointly by the United States and Israel. This virus, this worm, damaged centrifuges in Iran's Natanz uranium enrichment facility. These centrifuges, they essentially process uranium hexafluoride and enrich it to higher levels, and when you have 90% purity, you have weapons grade uranium. So the objective of this sabotage operation was to damage centrifuges in Iranian uranium enrichment facilities. So this Stuxnet operation even affected India, right? So, but that's not something we'll not discuss over here. So this Stuxnet cyber weapon is believed to be the first cyber weapon which was designed specifically to cause physical destruction to infrastructure. So there was the cyber attack, Stuxnet. Then there were assassinations of various Iranian nuclear scientists between 2010 and 2012. Several top Iranian nuclear scientists were assassinated in operations that are believed to have been conducted by Israel's Mossad intelligence agency. And these killings obviously were part of an effort to delay or impede Israel's nuclear progress by eliminating key personnel. And then there was sabotage of Iranian nuclear facilities, and Israel has been accused of doing that, various acts of sabotage against these nuclear facilities. There were explosions at the Natanz enrichment plant in 2020 as well as 2021. So Iran has responded with its own cyber attacks against Israeli infrastructure, and Iran has said that it will continue its nuclear program despite whatever setbacks are imposed upon it. So this conflict in the 2010s, in the 2000s, in the 21st century, has acquired a nuclear dimension, and this is a particularly dangerous element to this rivalry, and this has raised the stakes of the confrontation significantly, the nuclear dimension. And now, in the 2020s, we have a direct confrontation, which also has escalated slowly. It has gone up the escalation ladder, but now we are transitioning from shadow war to open conflict. So this has happened in the last 4-5 years, and there's more direct confrontation. So Israel has conducted a campaign of airstrikes against Iranian targets in Syria. And the objective, and this is when you had Mr. Assad, who was ruling Syria as a dictator, essentially. So these airstrikes were aimed at preventing Iran from establishing a permanent military presence near Israel's borders. And so there were nuclear concerns, Iran's advancing nuclear program, and Israel's determination to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons, and the weakening of Iran's axis of resistance also is part of this. Following Israel's military operations against Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon, and eventually the overthrow of Mr. Assad in Syria. We are not there yet. We will discuss it. So then you have the 2024-2025 escalation, uh, in which you had unprecedented direct exchanges of fire between the two nations. So on April 1, 2024, Israel bombed an Iranian consulate complex, a diplomatic uh, property in Damascus, Syria, which killed multiple senior Iranian officials. And in response to this, Iran launched its first ever direct missile attack on Israel. On April 13 and 14, 2024, Iran fired approximately 300 drones, cruise missiles, and possibly ballistic missiles, most of which were intercepted by Israel and other allied air defenses like Jordan, etc. And then by Israel retaliated with strikes on Iranian military sites on April 19, 2024. But at this point in time, it was attempting to avoid escalation to full scale war. And then tensions continued to rise with the assassination of a Hamas political leader, Ismail Haniyeh, in Tehran on July 31, 2024. And Iran obviously blamed Israel for this. And in response, Israel launched another missile attack on Israel on October 1, 2024, which prompted further Israeli strikes on Iranian targets. And now, as of today, the conflict has reached its most dangerous point in June, starting around June 13 or so this year, which is just a few days ago, with the Israel launching the Operation Rising Lion, which has been a major ongoing strike against Iranian nuclear facilities and military targets. So Israel has claimed that this operation has been necessary to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons, and Israel targeted three major Iranian nuclear facilities, which is Natanz, Isfahan, and Fordo. And Israel also assassinated several prominent scientists who have been engaged in nuclear research, Iranian scientists. And Iran has responded with missile attacks on Israel. And the conflict has now expanded to include Iranian allies and proxies like the Houthis in Yemen, who have also launched ballistic missiles, at Israeli targets. So now we are in a very hot war kind of situation. So this conflict has profoundly shaped the geopolitics of West Asia, of the Middle East. So there's been the realignment of regional alliances. We know that Iran has this significant hostility towards Israel, and Iran has nuclear ambitions. And because of all of this has led to the creation of an informal alliance between Israel and the Arab nations, particularly Gulf nations like the UAE and Bahrain. And this was formalized by the Abraham Accords that were signed in 2020 under the guidance, you could say, of the then US president, and once again now US President Donald Trump. And this rivalry has fueled proxy wars across the region, particularly in Syria, where you had a regime change operation which succeeded, and also in Lebanon, in Yemen. And this has caused a tremendous amount of destabilization of these regions and tremendous amount of humanitarian suffering. And Iran's nuclear program has also raised fears of a regional nuclear arms race, which raises the possibility that certain other West Asian countries could potentially want to seek their own nuclear capabilities in response to Iran potentially going nuclear, right? So, yeah, it's profoundly shaped this region. Now, you have international dimensions, of course. We know that Israel has very powerful allies. So, this conflict has drawn in global powers and international organizations. The US is obviously going to be involved. The US is a key supporter of Israel, and the US has led international efforts to constrain Iran's nuclear program through sanctions, through diplomacy, through agreements, and so on and so forth, from walking out of agreements and so on. Then there's Russia. So Russia and China both Both are involved, and both these nations have generally maintained close relations with Iran. And this, of course, is going to be a balancing act, right? And this has complicated uh, all the efforts to address the conflict and make the conflict simmer down. And the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, is also involved in the matter. They have played a very important role in monitoring Iran's nuclear program and verifying that Iran is in compliance with various international agreements. So this conflict has become a focal point of international diplomacy, security concerns, and it has implications that go way beyond the local region, the West Asia, Middle East region, the Gulf region. It goes way beyond that because this region is a prime provider of energy to the entire world. So that's the deal thus far. Now let's quickly go through the timeline of what has happened thus far. So Operation Rising Lion, which is all about the lion that used to be on the Iranian flag. So this operation was started by Israel. It began on the 13th of June this year. So in the early hours, in the morning of June 13, Israel launched this operation, which was a massive coordinated military campaign which targeted Iran's nuclear facilities, military installations, and key personnel and leaders. So this operation began with waves, with waves of airstrikes, in which involved more than 200 Israeli fighter jets, including F-35 fighter planes. And these fighter planes dropped more than 330 munitions on approximately 100 targets across Iran. That's a massive, massive operation. And simultaneously, you had Mossad operations that sabotaged Iran's air defense systems and missile infrastructure, which possibly could have been done by using smuggled precision weapons and a covert drone base near Tehran, which kind of evokes echoes of Operation Spiderweb conducted by Ukraine within Russia, right? Then you had targeted strikes against the Natanz nuclear facility, which is one of Iran's most important uranium enrichment sites. And this caused significant damage to the above ground sections of the Natanz nuclear facility, but the major part of it is deep underground, so that would not have been affected. And there were attacks on military bases, infrastructure installations, and neighborhoods where you had senior commanders who lived. So those neighborhoods were targeted, their apartments were targeted. And so that's how Operation Rising Lion began on June the 13th this year. Then you had an initial response, naturally, from Iran. So after the Israeli strikes, Iran launched its own military retaliation, a retaliatory operation, and they called it Operation True Promise the Third. So what happened in this operation? Approximately 100 Shahed drones were deployed towards Israel, many of which were intercepted by Israeli, Jordanian, and other allied forces. Then there was the launch by Iran of approximately 150 ballistic missiles in two waves, and these missiles targeted Israeli military sites, intelligence facilities, and residential areas. The Houthi armed group in Yemen, which is an ally of Iran, they fired a ballistic missile which targeted Jerusalem. It landed in Hebron, apparently, and injured some people. But apparently, the damage has been reasonably limited, and the casualties have not been too many. That's what the Israelis have reported. So that's on June 13 and 14. Now, June 15, you have an escalation of Israeli strikes. So Israel expanded its military campaign on this day, June 15. They targeted the Iranian Ministry of Justice building in Tehran. They targeted a refueling plane at Mashhad airport, approximately 2,500 kilometers from Israeli territory, which is probably the most distant operation by the Israeli Air Force in its history. Then you had surface-to-air missiles and additional military bases across Iran that were hit, and so on. There were car bombings, 5 detonations across Tehran, and so on. So you have an escalation of the Israeli strikes that happened on June the 15th, and the Israeli military also warned Iranian civilians to evacuate areas surrounding weapons factories, military bases like Shiraz, and so on. So that's the escalation. Now let's look at what happened after that. Uh, June 16, June 17, you have continued exchanges. This was the fourth day of the conflict. Israel struck the command center of Iran's Quds force in Tehran, and Israel claimed to have destroyed 120 surface to surface missile launchers, which is approximately 30% of Iran's missile stockpile. And Israel claimed to have achieved full air supremacy in Tehran's airspace, which is a major claim. So it looks like they have suppressed the Iranian air defenses and maybe taken out the Iranian Air Force. Then Iran did not just back down, they launched fresh waves of missile and drone attacks. And these attacks targeted Tel Aviv, they targeted Haifa, they targeted other places. And many of these missiles did hit, as we have seen, right? And at the same time, it has emerged, reports have emerged that Iran has sought mediation from Qatar, from Oman, and Saudi Arabia to engage with the United States. And Iran seems to want to halt the strikes and to revive the nuclear negotiations that have been stalled. So that is June 16 and 17. And now we will talk about the latest developments the past couple of days. So the most recent phase of the conflict. So what have we seen? We have seen Israeli airstrikes involving more than 50 fighter jets. They targeted about 20 buildings in Tehran, including factories that produce materials and components for ballistic missiles. They have had 2 confirmed strikes on Iranian centrifuge production facilities in Karaj and the Tehran Research Center. And Iran has launched its 12th phase of Operation True Promise the Third, using new generation missiles, including a super heavy ballistic missile, the Sejjul missile. And it looks like there are mass evacuations happening from Tehran as the residents are fleeing the Israeli bombardments. There is massive bombardment happening apparently in Tel Aviv as well. And the US President, Mr. Trump, has fueled speculation about the potential of a US military involvement, the US joining the conflict. And he has said that I may not, when he was asked about whether the US will join Israel's strikes on Iran. So he has left it open as of now. Iran's nuclear program seems to have been degraded to a certain extent. So Israel's military campaign is focused on 3 primary objectives. First of all, to degrade Iran's nuclear program. So they have struck at the Natanz nuclear facility. They have caused significant damage to the above ground aspects of the facility, where Iran has been enriching uranium to 60% or more purity. Israel has done attacks on the Isfahan Nuclear Technology Center. They have damaged 4 critical buildings at this nuclear complex, which is Iran's largest nuclear research complex. The Israelis have targeted centrifuge production facilities in Karaj and Tehran, which were previously under IAEA monitoring, and they have been attempting to damage the Fordo fuel enrichment plan. But the effectiveness of those strikes remains unclear. Probably they have not really succeeded. So that is one thing they've been doing, degrading Iran's nuclear program. What else has been the objective of these attacks? The second objective has been to eliminate Iran's military leadership. So the Israelis have confirmed the killing of Major General Hossein Salami, the chief of the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. They have assassinated the intelligence chief and the deputy intelligence chief of the IRGC. They have assassinated at least 14 Iranian nuclear scientists, some through car bombs, some through other ways. And they claim to have eliminated over 16 senior members of Iran's military. What else have the Israelis done? They have destroyed Iran's military infrastructure to a certain extent. They have launched and landed strikes on missile production facilities in Shiraz and Tabriz. They have targeted the Iranian air defense systems to achieve what seems to be air superiority over Iranian airspace. They've destroyed about 120 surface to surface missile launchers, which, like I said, it's about 30% of Iran's stockpile. And they have attacked Iran's IRGC facilities near Tehran and Piran Shahar. Right? So this is what the Israelis have done thus far. Now, what's Iran's response been like? Iran's Operation True Promise the Third. So this is a retaliatory campaign, and Iran has employed a variety of tactics, multiple waves of ballistic missile strikes targeting various Israeli cities like Tel Aviv, like Haifa, like Jerusalem. They've used hypersonic Fatah 1 missiles, which Iran claims are repeatedly shaking the shelters in Tel Aviv. They've deployed new generation missiles, including the two-stage super heavy ballistic Sejil missile. Apart from that, they have launched drone attacks. More than 100 Shahed drones were launched towards Israel in the initial response. They have continued with the targeting of Israeli military and civilian infrastructure using drone swarms. The targeting strategy has been that they have struck at Iranian air bases from which the attacks on Iran were reportedly launched. They've attacked oil and gas infrastructure of Israel, including Haifa's oil refinery, which has apparently forced the operations to shut down over here. They have targeted residential areas in multiple cities like Tel Aviv and Ramadan and so on and so forth. So that is what they've been doing. So that's been the thing so far. Now, what's the United States response been like? So the US President, Mr. Trump, has issued, as always, mixed messages. He has praised the Israeli strikes as being excellent and very successful. And he's also suggested that he hopes for a deal. He hopes for a deal. Let's do a deal, right? Trump has also tweeted and demanded Iran's unconditional support in all caps. And he has threatened Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, with assassination. Trump has claimed that the US and Israel know the whereabouts of Iran's supreme leader and they could target him. The US has also moved military forces closer to the West Asia region. They have this includes air tankers. They've moved them to Europe, and the USS Nimitz aircraft carrier strike group has also been deployed in the region. And Trump has indicated that he's currently considering whether to join Israel in attacking Iran's nuclear sites, especially the Fordo facility. So that's been the US response thus far. This is an evolving situation. Then you've had other international relations reactions. The G7 leaders have called for de-escalation. They have stressed that Israel has the right to defend itself, and they've also stressed that Iran can never have a nuclear program, and Iran can never have a nuclear weapon. Then Russia has demanded that Israel stop its illegal attacks on Iran's nuclear sites, and Russia has accused Western nations of manipulation. China has accused Trump of pouring oil on the conflict. The Turkish President, Mr. Erdogan, has accused Mr. Netanyahu of being the biggest threat to the security of the region, and so on and so forth. And Oman is drafting a ceasefire proposal for nuclear talks, and so on. So this has been overall the international reactions thus far. What about the economic impact of this ongoing conflict? So this has significant economic repercussions that will go far beyond the region if this continues. So first of all, oil prices have surged by about 13% after the initial Israeli strikes. Brent crude has reached about $75.15 per barrel, which is the highest level in about 5 months. About 20% of the oil of the world's oil, it transits through the Strait of Hormuz, and Iran has threatened that we will close the Strait of Hormuz. We are capable of closing it if required, if the conflict continues. The Israeli shekel has fallen 2% against the dollar, and there is a surge in Israeli supermarket traffic, panic buying of various essential items, and so on. So clear economic impact, as we can see. Now the question is, what happens? Future prospects. So first of all, let's assess the situation as of today. So Israel claims that it has achieved significant tactical advantages. It has achieved full air supremacy over Iranian airspace. It has destroyed about 1/3 of Iran's missile launchers. Then there's a question of how effective have been the Israeli strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities. And it's especially when it comes to deeply buried facilities like the Fordo nuclear facility. So it doesn't look like those will have been would have incurred significant damage. And Iran has demonstrated that it is resilient. It has shown that it has significant retaliatory capabilities. It is continuing to launch missile strikes against on Israel, despite the Israeli claims of air superiority. So, yeah, there is this war of narratives happening, but Iran is continuing to launch missile strikes on Israel. That's an ongoing thing. What are the political implications in the region for Israel and for Iran? So, this conflict has provided Mr. Netanyahu with a lot of political breathing room domestically. So, polls are now showing there is overwhelming Israeli public support for Mr. Netanyahu, despite his previously uncertain political future. There have been allegations of corruption against him and so on, but now he's firmly in power, and he is the firm backing, overwhelming backing of the citizens of his country. The Iranian leadership, it is facing pressure to demonstrate strength while also managing the significant damage to its military and nuclear infrastructure. So that's a concern for Iran. And this conflict has united the Israeli political spectrum. It has united all the Israeli politicians behind Mr. Netanyahu. And so that's been one of the outcomes, positive outcomes from Mr. Netanyahu's perspective of this conflict. Then let's take a look at the ceasefire prospects. So Iranian officials have reportedly sent messages through various intermediaries, like I said, demonstrating Iran's willingness to stop the attacks if Israel halts its campaign. Israeli officials, they suggest that the operation against Iran could take 2 to 3 weeks, depending on what the political decisions are and the scope of the campaign. So what is the question is, what is this military operation and what could take 2 to 3 weeks? Are they claiming that they will achieve regime change in Tehran in 2 to 3 weeks? Are they claiming they will inflict a comprehensive military defeat on Iran in 2 to 3 weeks? I'm not sure what it means, but maybe it is deliberately ambiguous, this messaging from Israel. And Mr. Netanyahu has said that Israel is willing to call off the campaign if Iran accepts the US demand to dismantle its nuclear program completely. And the Iranian supreme leader, Mr. Khamenei, he has rejected Mr. Trump's demands for an unconditional surrender as being unacceptable. So these are the ceasefire prospects. It looks like Iran would like to have a ceasefire. Netanyahu is making maximalist demands. Trump is making maximalist demands. Iran is under pressure, but they are also hitting back at Israel. So right now it looks like the prospects of a ceasefire are a little dim as of right now, but we have to wait and watch. So now the question is, what happens? What could happen in the next week? What could happen in the next 3 months? We will not look beyond that. So what are the scenarios that we have? What are the prospects? What's the forecast? What are the projections for the next week to 3 days based on what's happening right now, the current conflict dynamics, and what we can analyze based on what's happened thus far and what each party wants? So scenario A, in my opinion, is a sustained regional conflict. This scenario has a 75% probability in my assessment, with a time horizon of 7 to 90 days. So what could happen in this scenario is that the direct state-on-state military exchanges between Israel and Iran will slowly de-escalate, but this conflict will continue and it will transform into a sustained high-intensity shadow war, proxy war across multiple fronts. There will be intense diplomatic pressure from the US, from Russia, from the other Gulf nations that stand to lose a lot from a conflict, from a protracted conflict. And this diplomatic pressure could establish fragile red lines, which could hopefully prevent a full-scale conventional war. The US will maintain a significant military presence, or maybe a more increased military presence in the region to enforce deterrence. But the US in this scenario will avoid direct participation in offensive operations against Iran. So this, in my opinion, is the most likely scenario, 75% probability over the next 3 months or so. What's the potential geopolitical impact of this? The impact is that the Middle East will then enter a new phase of protracted high-stakes instability with persistent risks to global energy markets and shipping routes, especially the vital choke point in the Strait of Hormuz. So I'm assuming for this scenario that both Israel and Iran want to avoid a full scale conventional war, which would be economically ruinous and militarily devastating. I'm also assuming that there'll be international mediation efforts via Oman, via Qatar. Even Russia will get involved, maybe China also. And these international efforts will be sufficient to create off ramps from direct state to state confrontation. And I'm also assuming that the US, its primary goal is deterrence and preventing a wider war that will endanger US assets in the region. It will endanger global stability. And the US wants uh, to achieve deterrence. The US doesn't want to achieve regime change in Iran, and so on. And we are also assuming that Iran's allies, proxies, Hezbollah, the Houthis, the Iraqi militias, etc., they remain a viable tool for a sustained and deniable pressure on Israel and its allies. So this, in my opinion, is the most likely scenario. 75% probability over the next 3 months or so. Okay, but it will cause an escalated situation of instability in the region. But a fragile de-escalation may happen with significant proxy war and shadow war ongoing for the foreseeable future. That's scenario A, 75% probability. What is scenario B? Scenario B has a 20% probability. It is not small, and this could happen in the next 2 weeks to next 2 months. Scenario B is that the US decides to get involved in the matter. The US intervenes, and then there is a regional war. So, what could trigger this? There could be some kind of a trigger event, like a successful Iranian proxy attack on a US warship, maybe a high casualty Iranian proxy strike on a US base, military base, or maybe a devastating Iranian missile attack on an Israeli population center, and such things, which could also be false flag operations potentially. I'm just saying it, okay? Potentially, hypothetically. So, such a scenario could prompt a direct and overt US military intervention. And then in this scenario, the US will coordinate with Israel and conduct strikes, maybe limited strikes on Iran's most hardened nuclear facilities, especially Fordow, and various key military command and control centers. And then the conflict could expand into a broader regional war, not total regional war, but a broader regional war. And then Iran will attempt to disrupt shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, and Iran will then attempt to launch retaliatory attacks on US assets, US military bases, and US allies in the Persian Gulf region, which is a very bad situation, right? So, in my opinion, this is a probability of 20%, which is not small. In the next 14 to 60 days, the potential geopolitical impact of this is a severe global energy crisis, a major disruption in international trade, and then there is a heightened potential for great power confrontation, as Russia and China may be forced to respond. So, this will happen if a key red line for the US is crossed, such as significant American casualties or a direct threat to the global energy supply. And what Mr. Trump said, that I may not, about joint strikes with Israel, this kind of resolves in favor of direct action, which is scenario B. Um, the assumption, once again, is that Israel on its own is incapable of neutralizing Iran's most hardened nuclear sites without direct US military support. And that is what most intelligence reports are suggesting. Yeah, so this is a bad scenario, scenario B, which is a broader regional war, which begins with US direct intervention in the conflict. 20% probability. And scenario C, in my opinion, has a small probability of happening, 5% probability of happening over the next 7 to 30 days, which is a rapid de-escalation. I think it's very unlikely that this happens. So in this scenario, what you will have is that there'll be extreme economic volatility. the severity of the exchanges, which will be devastating for both nations. There'll be extreme economic volatility, which is bad for the world. And because of all this, there will be successful high level mediation, which will compel both the sides to pull back from the brink of warfare. So Israel will say that we have achieved significant tactical objectives by degrading Iran's nuclear infrastructure, eliminating key military leaders, and so on. And so, based on that, Israel will agree to halt this Operation Rising Lion, and Iran, which will be facing major damage and the credible threat of US intervention, will also agree to a ceasefire and a return to the negotiating table. And then a new diplomatic track emerges, which leads to talks, and it leads to a revised, more stringent nuclear agreement between Iran and the US. So I think this is a low probability scenario, just 5% probability over the next 7 to 30 days. And the geopolitical impact is that there will be a temporary stabilization of West Asia, of the Middle East, and a potential breakthrough in talks in nuclear non-proliferation, but underlying tensions will remain, right? So that's a low probability scenario, in my opinion, and that would be a great win for Trump. A deal. He's going to get a deal. So that's the deal. Now the question is also about the nuclear question, right? Will Iran conduct a nuclear test? Because if Iran gets more and more pressured and it feels that it's running out of options, then it may decide that the best way out is to demonstrate a nuclear capability, so that major nations will back off. So in my estimation, the best estimate probability of a nuclear test, of Iran conducting a nuclear test, is about 10 to 15% over the next 7 to 90 days. An overt nuclear test. That's what I believe. And the factors that could affect the probability of a nuclear test is that Iran has sufficient 60% plus enriched uranium hexafluoride for several weapons, maybe 8-9 nuclear weapons it could make reasonably soon. The assumption is that Israeli strikes have destroyed centrifuges and cascades at key facilities, but some of them still remain. We know that the IAEA has been forced to withdraw after June 16th, so that would allow Iran to act rapidly, right? And the Iranian leadership could vow to accelerate the program despite attacks in order to ensure the survivability of the nation and of the government. So these are the factors that could affect the nuclear probability. These are the pathways that could push the likelihood of an Iranian nuclear test higher. So if two or more of these triggers happen, then the probability could go higher. What are the pathways? So once again, the pathways to higher nuclear test likelihood. If Iran is able to enrich uranium to above 90%, sufficient quantities of uranium, then this happens. Then there is if Iran is able to resume hydrodynamic testing at Parchin or a new desert site. If diplomacy fails, if there's a collapse of Oman or whatever other nation, Qatar-based mediated ceasefire talks, then there's a higher likelihood of a nuclear test. If the Iranian government seeks to rally national unity around a nuclear triumph, which seems to be, there seems to be some sentiment in Iran towards that, and so on. And the last thing is that if there could be external guarantees, maybe from Russia, from China, or both, then there's a higher likelihood of a nuclear test that Iran could do. And then the probability will inch higher to maybe towards 20 or 25%. What are the factors that could keep the probability low? What are the factors that could limit the probability of an Iranian nuclear test? One is that there could be severe infrastructure damage, which means that Iran would need several weeks to repair the centrifuge losses before producing weapons grade uranium metal. Then technological hurdles could exist, which is a rather opaque part of Iran's nuclear program. We don't know how advanced the program is. So there could be technical hurdles. Iran doesn't have a declared remote testing range where they could test a nuclear weapon. There is a place called Parchin, where they could create dig tunnels and perhaps do an underground test perhaps over there. But that would be very observable, which could lead to a preemptive US or Israeli strike, airstrike or missile strike on the region. So that once again is a logistical issue that Iran may not be able to surmount. Then there is obviously an economic risk. There's the risk of wholesale sanctions and an oil embargo, etc., which could cripple Iran's already stressed economy. And maybe Russia could intervene, and could maybe Russia could offer a fuel take back formula, which could offer an alternative prestige win without crossing the nuclear threshold, the nuclear Rubicon. So these are the factors that could potentially limit the probability of an Iranian nuclear test. So the bottom line is that there is a tremendous amount of tension, unprecedented tension. There's the withdrawal of the IAEA inspectors, and yet a full-scale overt nuclear test from Iran still remains unlikely, but not impossible. And you have technical disruptions that could be a factor. There could be catastrophic diplomatic and military costs, also economic costs that could weigh against a nuclear test. So the most likely path, in my opinion, is that there is going to be accelerated progress towards the nuclear threshold, but it will still remain covered. So if weaponization happens, they will not test it. And Iran will probably prefer to maintain nuclear ambiguity while rebuilding the capacity it has that has been degraded by the potential damage to its facilities by Israeli strikes. And Iran will most likely want to avoid clear red lines that could trigger a massive response, most importantly from the US. So the probability of an Iranian nuclear test is still low, but it is not negligible. It is definitely there. Now we have to ask ourselves: will there be a pro-US Israel regime change in Tehran? Right, that's a big question. So I think there's a small probability that this happens. The probability of a pro-Western regime change, regime replacement in the next 7 to 90 days is about 5 to 8%, and it's really difficult to do that. So the West is propping up this gentleman, the son of the Iranian Shah, as the potential next leader of Iran. But I think that this is a low probability event, and I'll tell you why. So why is regime change probability so low? So look, the IRGC, which is the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, it remains more or less intact. It remains very large. The Basij, which is the regular army network, that also remains large and more or less intact, right? So even after the killing of various important IRGC personnel, the intelligence chief, his deputy, and so on, the Iranian forces continue the continued coordinated missile and drone operations, which shows that there is significant resilience in the Iranian military command. There's been a leadership decapitation campaign, elimination of senior leaders, senior commanders, and so on. And yet, for example, the IRGC commander Hossein Salami, right? So that happened. And yet, there is resilience in the leadership. Then, when you have a nation that's under siege with a multiplicity of external actors who are all attacking the nation, what happens is that the citizens of the nation, they all come together in support of whichever government is in power. So there could be this nationalist sentiment that could be galvanized by these external attacks, which could, lead to a surge of support for the Iranian government and dampen whatever opposition exists. And we also have the fact that there is a lack of an organized and armed protest movement against the Iranian government. So all of these pressures, they outweigh these downward pressures, they outweigh the upward pressures, which is why the probability of a regime change is pretty low. What are the things that could raise the odds of a regime change? A leadership vacuum, right? If there is a sudden death or incapacitation of the supreme leader of Iran without an agreed successor, that could potentially, hypothetically, trigger a power struggle, maybe IRGC versus the clerics or something like that. Okay, if there is some kind of schism in the security forces of Iran. Maybe the IRGC units start refusing orders, or they start siding with protesters if there are any. That could cause an upward movement in the probability of a regime change operation. If there's a mass uprising, maybe mass urban uprising, spontaneous protests in multiple regional cities, capitals, etc., which could go on for several days, similar to what happened in 1979, but with anti-government slogans. Well, that could push the probability upwards. And if there is a foreign military escalation on the ground, at the ground level in Iran, that would be a game changer. So if there is a rapid joint Israeli-US thrust to seize key military facilities, key nuclear sites, maybe Natanz, maybe Isfahan, that region, followed by the installation of a transitional government acceptable to Washington. Well, if all these things, or maybe two or more of these things, these events happen, unfold simultaneously, then the probability could go higher, maybe 15-20% probability. What are the factors that keep the risk of regime change low? What are the factors that maintain the stability of the Iran regime? So historically, we know that the Islamic Republic of Iran has endured. It's been resilient. It has endured the 1980 to 1988 war, the Iran-Iraq war. It has endured years, maybe decades of crippling sanctions. It has endured the 2009 to 2019 protest cycles without any regime collapse. The IRGC controls large portions of the economy and the media, so there's economic control. There is support and assistance from Russia and China, who could provide emergency assistance. So there's external support. And there is obviously the most important factor is that there doesn't seem to be any Western willingness to commit ground forces for a 2003 Iraq-like operation, where there was a massive invasion, ground invasion of Iraq. Without boots on the ground, you can't effect regime change, remotely. And there's also the risk that any leadership, any government, any regime installed by the West, a puppet regime of the West, would lack legitimacy in the eyes of the Iranian people. So it possibly may not last, right? So that's why there is this possibility that the Iranian government will endure. What are the indicators that could tell you in advance that maybe a regime change could be about to happen? What are the indicators that we should monitor? So one of the indicators is that there could be sudden defections from the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps or the Artesh regular army units. If that happens, that's an indicator. If there are large-scale protests and strikes and demonstrations in big cities like Tehran or Tabriz or Mashhad or Shiraz that go on beyond 24, 48, 72 hours, well, that's a regime change indicator to note. If there is the formation of a unified opposition coalition, maybe in exile, which receives open funding from the West, from Israel, from the Gulf nations, that's an indicator. If there are unusual military deployments, troops being deployed and troops being moved towards Tehran, not towards the Israeli front, but towards Tehran, well, that's an indicator that something could be afoot. And maybe if there are emergency meetings, succession meetings among senior clerics of the regime in the city of Qom, well, that could be an indicator of potential regime change. So what's the bottom line on regime change? So thus far, what we see is that there have been tremendous strikes, unprecedented Israeli strikes. There is intense external pressure on Iran, and yet Iran's core power structures are showing cohesion. They're showing resilience. They are not showing any signs of fragmentation. There have been casualties among the top commanders in Iran. There have been calls for regime change from outside. So these things do raise long-term vulnerability. But in the next 90 days, three months or so, I think that window is too short for all of this to come together, for military forces, for political forces, for societal, social forces, and so on. All of this to come together and install a pro-Western government. So for now, the durability and continuation of the Islamic government of Iran continues to be the base case, and a regime change is an unlikely possibility, is an unlikely thing to happen thus far. Um, so that is the deal. That's the deal, and that's where we are right now. Now we have to ask ourselves some questions before we end. There are some important questions we have to ask ourselves. The first question is, it's something I did discuss. Can Israel destroy Iran's nuclear program without the help of the US? That's one thing we have to ask ourselves. So, one of the key nuclear facilities of Iran is Fordow. It is buried far under a mountain, hundreds of meters below a mountain. It contains advanced centrifuges. It is crucial to Iran's enrichment capabilities. It has not taken any damage. And to destroy the Fordow plant would require what the Americans called heavy bunker buster bombs, massive ordnance penetrator bombs, which are like 30,000 pound bombs, right? These are capable of penetrating targets deep underground, maybe hundreds of meters underground, amount perhaps. But these can only be dropped from US B-2 stealth bombers. So without this, the Iranian nuclear program cannot be destroyed. So Israel on its own is not capable of destroying Iran's nuclear program without US assistance. Secondly, can Israel effect a regime change operation successfully in Iran without US help? Well, once again, the answer is no. Without having boots on the ground and without launching a massive 2003 Iraq style operation, there will not be regime change within Iran. The regime is remarkably resilient, and it's not going to go down that easily. Third, have the Israeli strikes crippled Iran? So, for example, in 1967, the Six-Day War, the Israelis crippled the Egyptian Air Force on the 5th of June in just one coordinated multiple waves of attacks. So, have the Israeli strikes crippled Iran in that way? Well, once again, Iran has not been crippled. Iran is hitting back. It's hitting back constantly. So it's clear that Israel is not going to complete this mission of theirs on its own. Tehran is going to keep on hitting back. Now the question is this: if Mr. Netanyahu stops the strikes on Iran now, well, then what will he have achieved? Nothing significant. You could even some observers could even claim that it will be a defeat for Mr. Netanyahu. And Mr. Trump has also said that Iran can still negotiate and sign a deal with the Americans and whoever. So it's clear that Israel needs the US to join the war, right? And it's also possible that if the US joins the war, then Iran will hit US military bases all across West Asia with its very capable missiles. And if the Americans get involved, then Iran will do its best to shut down the Strait of Hormuz. And that could be a complete mess, a complete disaster. One thing the Israelis and Americans could do is potentially assassinating the supreme leader of Iran. Mr. Trump has threatened that. He has indirectly threatened that. So let's say they do that, okay, hypothetically. They assassinate the supreme leader of Iran. Will that cause immediate collapse of the Iranian government? I don't think it will. It will cause chaos, but it will not cause the collapse of the Iranian government. Mr. Khamenei's son, Mujtaba Khamenei, will most likely be the next leader with much greater legitimacy among the clergy, because he will be the son of a martyr. And even if he is assassinated, then you can expect that even more stridently anti-US, anti-Israel elements could eventually become the next in line for the leadership. So what is clear is that Israel cannot achieve its objectives on its own. If the US gets involved, it's going to be a much larger conflagration that will involve the whole of the Middle East, West Asia, Gulf region, right? The US itself cannot cause a regime change reliably without a massive ground operation. And even if it does a massive ground operation, a massive ground invasion like 2003 Iraq, then there will be significant resistance to the US, maybe worse than what the Americans faced in Afghanistan. And I don't think the Shah, the current so-called Shah of Iran, will be regarded as a legitimate ruler. by the people of Iran, because he will be propped up by the Americans. So if the Americans want the Shah, the current son, the son of Muhammad Reza Pahlavi, to rule Iran, they will have to prop him up with military might, which means a full-scale occupation of Iran, which will come at a huge cost. So which direction are we going in? All these options look terrible to me. Absolute chaos and a disaster for the global economy, a disaster for global supply chains, and so on. So it's not looking good. The best case scenario is that this all simmers down, which is option A of my forecast, with a 75% or so probability. The last question I would like to address is, if there's a regime change in Iran, how is it for India? What does it mean for India? Is it a good thing for India, or is it a bad thing for India? Well, you only have to go back to the 1960s and so on, when the Shah, Mr. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was ruling Iran as a dictator. He was a US asset, he was a Western asset. And at that time, he was a strong supporter of Pakistan. When there was a war between India and Pakistan in 1965, Iran supported Pakistan. Iran allowed Pakistan to fly its fighter jets and land them in Iranian air bases so that India would not destroy them. And Iran supported Pakistan in other ways as well. So if you have a pro-US government that is propped up in Tehran, it's going to be bad for India. We already have East Pakistan and West Pakistan, which is Bangladesh and West Pakistan. And now you will have another pro-US regime west of West Pakistan, which would be Iran. So the entire region will essentially turn against India. And this, if the Americans can make it happen, it will be kind of in line with the great dream of Mr. Mackinder, which was to control the rimland of the world island in order to eventually make a move on the heartland, which is Eurasia, the core, the heartland of Eurasia, which is Russia, China, Mongolia, all of that. But that is still a far-fetched dream. But if Iran falls and if Iran gets a pro-US government, it's going to be not good for India. India will get essentially isolated in the region. So that is where we are at, my friends. It is a bad situation that we are seeing in the Middle East. One hopes that scenario A, with a 75% probability, one hopes that scenario comes to pass, and there is a simmering down of the conflict, and hopefully some kind of international mediation, and the conflict won't go away. It will remain a hot conflict, but it will remain below the threshold of a state-on-state conflict. So it looks like the global instability is spreading. You had a major flashpoint in Ukraine. Now you have a major flashpoint in West Asia. And that seems to be the pattern in the world right now. So we're going to keep an eye on this evolving situation, on the evolving scenario. And tomorrow we're going to discuss, in the Indian interest, the India-US relationship. And if you have any questions, well, I will take those questions up very soon, in a couple of minutes, in the Ask Abhijit show, which will begin immediately after this live stream ends. So thank you very much for watching. I hope this gave you some value, some understanding, some clarity on what's happening and what could happen. If this was of some value to you, please like, share, subscribe, and I will see you in the Ask Abhijit show, which will begin momentarily. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you soon.